It is being recorded.
Great.
So last time I functioned as the facilitator. I think I'm planning on doing that again. But if anybody objects in the form of they would like to be the facilitator instead, speak up.
I think I was the recorder last time, and what I'd like to do is just put notes at the end of those statistical simulations documents since we already have the links.
That's great. Yeah. Did you all hear that?
Sounds great.
What did she say?
She said she's going to record notes at the end of Amelia's document.
Okay.
That works.
Okay. So here's a suggestion for a structure. That we ask Amelia to give an overview. I suppose I should also ask, raise your hand if you have read the paper already.
What's the paper?
Most of it.
You said, what's the paper?
Yeah.
Let me put a link to the paper in the chat of Zoom, and that will get you to the paper. So the suggested structure is that Amelia gives us a brief summary so that most of us have read the paper, but I think it's useful to hear what's on her mind now.
Mm-hmm.
And that then we go quickly around, and this is difficult to do quickly, but we hear a little bit from everybody about their take on it. So it's not that you're going to try to summarize it or answer a question. You're just saying very briefly what interested you about the paper, something like that. And that then we dive in with Amelia leading us in discussion of the paper. How does that sound?
Sounds good to me.
Okay, so you're on first, Amelia.
Okay. Well, yeah, it sounds like most people have read this, and I saw with the great comment feature, lots of comments from people. So I'd love to talk about some of those when we get more deeply into it. But essentially, Bill and I were talking about statistical simulations, and at the beginning of this document, I say that I sort of see there being two different ways that you could have a simulation in statistics. One is you have some model and you want to generate data that is consistent with that model, and then the other way is to have data and you want to simulate from the data to generate new samples. So with the model and generating data, that to me feels like a sort of a probability task. Like you might be flipping a coin, you might be taking a draw from a distribution, you might be doing something with cards. Those are sort of your model. And I'm a little bit less interested in that because they don't feel as statistical to me. And I'm more interested in statistics than probability. I think people had some feedback about how those types of simulations could be used. But that's sort of my perspective. So then if we're thinking about simulations from data, there's two main methods that I consider: randomization, which lets you see what nothing looks like, what a null distribution looks like, what a null plot looks like. There's bootstrapping, which lets you kind of explore the sample space so that you could see, here are some other, with sampling variability, some other possibilities of what I could have seen in terms of a statistic or a plot. So I think the sort of statistical material is in an appendix, which was in the PDF document if people wanted to read it. And then I spent a little bit more time in this document talking about how randomization and the Bootstrap could be applied to plots. So the randomized plots, we have the lineup protocol where we have null plots and we try and pick our true plot out of the null plots. And then the bootstrapped plots, I like this idea from Jessica Hallman about hypothetical outcome plots where you can see the sampling variability and how that might have had an effect on your plot. So then the big question is how you could integrate this stuff into CODAP. And I came up with some problems that occurred to me when I started thinking about that. So I think there's an outline that should be showing up on the side of the document, but there's sort of like 3 things that I came up with, which is differentiating the data that came from a simulation from the real data, the speed at which you would run the simulations and the degree to which animation gets incorporated, and then more generally just kind of interface choices and how it could be drawn throughout. So I have a few screenshots from applets and web tools that do this sort of thing, and a screenshot from Tinkerplots about the sampler. I hadn't realized the simulation capabilities of Fathom before writing this document. I think because it's not one of the main buttons at the top, and I'm not an experienced Fathom user. So it was nice to see the videos of using Fathom that I think Tim posted. And yeah, so then at the end I had some interface choices, how they could be integrated into a tool. And I think the commonality between all these ideas that I came up with is they're all graphical or visual. So it's a button or a gesture, or you aren't typing code. So with the simulation tools in Fathom, it seemed like you had to be pretty adept at opening the window and writing, whatever your call was going to be, and putting things together in this sort of a specific way. And to me, if you're like, that feels like writing code. And if you're going to write code, why not write our code? But that's my personal bias. So I think I'm arguing for something that's really visual and as physical feeling as it can be. I think that was my final takeaway.
Okay, so this next part is hard because we're going to go quickly around. So it means you have to say just a couple of sentences about what was interesting, what's interesting to you at this moment from having read the paper. And I'm going to go on my screen clockwise around. Each of us has different people in different places. And Tim is at the top left for me, so Tim, you're on. But we can't hear you.
Yes, and I have to unmute in order to be heard, which may or may not be a good idea. All right, well, I really enjoyed the paper. Yes, it's interesting that many of the overall issues that you bring up we solved in the Fathom design some time ago, but they do require creating formulas. We can disagree about how much that's like coding, but that's for later. I'm really intrigued by the idea of how can we do this more gesturally? Is that really possible?
Great. Now, next on my screen is our camera. So I'm going to go around with us. Yeah.
Okay, I was intrigued by visualizing variability, to have these.
I don't think everybody knows you, Joachim.
I'm Joachim, I'm just a guest here, a visitor.
For a long time.
I came already in end of August, and I will enjoy staying here for another 6 weeks. Wonderful to be here. Okay. Again, I mean, I enjoyed the perspective of having variability interactively, dynamically represented, not just in a formula or a standing plot, but something that flickers, that moves on. And I learned about different ways to represent that.
Jonathan?
I'm Jonathan Sando, software engineer on CODAP, and it's an interesting paper. And like Tim, I'm interested in how I didn't get from the paper, but I'm interested in how gestures and so forth can be used in CODAP to do programming without programming, because I do think that's a difficulty for secondary school users, and it's makes CODAP less capable for them.
Talia?
I'm typing at the same time, so apologies. So I'm Talia, project coordinator and research associate for CODAP, and I mostly agree with Tim and Jonathan. I was very interested in the overall issues, and the examples that Amelia used were really beautiful. Especially, I wasn't familiar with randomization or bootstrapping, and I thought that those were nice examples that could be used in the curriculum. And I think what struck me about the paper was just how we can use gestures and thinking of data as malleable in this way using CODAP, and what opportunities we have to create something like that.
Kirk?
Kirk Swenson, Concord Consortium software engineer, and before that, Fathom software engineer. And in that light, having been directly involved in the development and implementation of the Fathom simulation capabilities, and indirectly with the Tinkerplots versions, I'm intrigued by the notions of thinking about some of the ideas that are in here, and trying to figure out what a third iteration of this might look like, and that takes what we've learned from the other instance cases and come up with something hopefully new and better.
And next on my screen is Rob.
Well, I read the paper most recently, which was while Amelia was talking. So my insights are quite fresh and undeveloped. And they're based on kind of recent experiences I've had that have shed some skepticism on randomization and all as a teaching tool, particularly I think in the applet environment. So what I'm really intrigued by is how the use of coding maybe can, and maybe through the use of gestures, capture the kind of the best features of things that we learn from coding to help strengthen this understanding that we want to develop through randomization. And all I'll say about my skepticism is I've seen so many examples of randomization and bootstrapping becoming just yet another procedure that doesn't develop understanding or doesn't develop argumentation in students. And I think maybe coding is one solution around that. And coding has its own challenges, and so maybe gestures are a way we can capture the strength of coding without some of the challenges.
Cliff?
Well, this is a fun thing to think about. And one issue, there seemed to be a sense in your paper, Amelia, that these capabilities ought to be everywhere and simple. And my intuition is somewhat the opposite, that often if you want somebody to understand something, making it simple is the exact wrong thing to do. That and this is an area, and by the way, even though this capability is in Tinkerplots, we never we never really tested it much with students because we're working with middle school students. And it is certainly one of those areas where I feel like the software design has to, or at best, ought to go along with activity design and testing it in the classrooms. That you don't want to just think about usability issues. You want to think about an approach, what it takes, and then use that to inform how you design that in the software, assuming that we're designing this not for professionals, but for people who are trying to help understand the logic of these things. I guess the other aspect of the way we implemented Tinker plots is we thought it was important to actually do this thing in, to have students import data into a chance device that they were familiar with, so that they really saw and trusted the random component of it, rather than have it being sort of done behind the scenes where they didn't really understand what was going on. But again, that was not something we tested, so I'm not sure how much of a role it would play. Those are my thoughts.
Dan?
It's hard going later in the list here, but I guess I found it really interesting in the sense that I really liked the intuitive approach of understanding what it is, what it means to be, is the value I have significant? Of course, in our statistical sense, but how do students realize that, right? And then the only way that most people learn about that is by you tell them they need to figure out what's the appropriate statistical test to apply, and 99.9 have absolutely no idea what or why. It's just a set of algorithmic rules. So, I find the trust the statistics part makes people feel like they can't really make an argument other than, the book says it's true. Mm-hmm. And being able to actually think about what's, am I really seeing, can I make the conclusion that I want to make? And having some tools in CODAP to help us do that, I think would be useful. In terms of the, integrated everywhere all the time, I guess I'm not, it seems like there's a time when you want to use this kind of thing. And in making it available during those times when it's appropriate is something that will be a challenge for us to figure out, because you don't necessarily want it in people's face all the time.
Great. Holly Lynn.
So I think that not to say something a little bit different that adds on to particularly what Rob and Cliff were saying, and this goes back to a point that Amelia made when we first started talking at the beginning of her paper, that she saw the two different types as being very different. Simulations from a model, and then simulations from data, or randomization, or bootstrapping. But even if you're doing randomization and bootstrapping, you're building a model. You have to build a model to do that. So I think that all of this, we have to, that there has to be model building capabilities in this. And it could be from a device, like Cliff was saying, a chance device, but you can also use chance devices in a way to kind of enact your null models, to kind of instantiate what you're trying to do there. And I would push us to kind of think about, I think that there's a lot more tighter cognitive connection between the way one needs to think about randomness and core probability ideas, in even doing the statistical aspects that Amelia was saying that she was attracted to in those second types. And that I think we need to attend to those. And I think that the ideas of trying to make interfaces that are intuitive to use, not necessarily easy button pushing, bam, it does it, but invitational and intuitive, I think could help with this, and that if we came up with representations and gestures that helped make a tighter connection to cognitively what students might be having to try to enact when they're building these models and generating data from them. And I love the idea of generating straight to a graph. I mean, I thought the graphical plots that you were providing for us to think about were awesome. And you know, that's a very different way of kind of thinking about data from models. So I'll stop there.
Corey.
Hi, I'm Corey. I really enjoyed the paper and felt I also wanted to say that thank you for inviting me to be in the conversation. The thing that struck me is probably not a surprise for people who know me is that is the way that things that I want to think about in terms of group users, classroom users as a group of users might fit into some of the innovations in visualizing variability that that the paper outlines. So if you think about this as a problem for a single user, there's a lot of conceptual challenges in bootstrapping and randomization. But if you look at the lineup or the hop and experienceable representations that you and the other links were kind of pushing us towards, they have a groupy feel. So the lineup, you can imagine producing it through bootstrapping and replacement, or you can imagine generating something like that with all of the Hollywood squares are null models except one, and you're but you could also imagine a group of kids doing one sample and contributing their results. And the question is, when does using a group facilitate the conceptual leap that the individual student has to do? There's a big logistical challenge and software development challenge to make groups be able to do things together, but sometimes really hard conceptual leaps can happen when individuals focus on one thing, but they talk to each other about the relationship between their one thing and other people's one thing. And it feels like some of the things with animation over time or things with lineup over space could be constructed in really natural ways by one student doing one small thing, a whole group of them doing that same small thing, and then talking about the difference in their outcomes. So even though, like, it's in the history of educational software, it's like a better bet that millions of people are going to use your single user software than that millions of people are going to use your whole classroom software. Even if somebody has a peripheral experience with that groupy experience, they can have in their mind when they're using individual software that it could have been done by a group, and that's a really useful heuristic for some of the processes. Like replacement is a weird thing unless you think about all the sampling happening simultaneously, and that is what's happening when the whole group goes at it. I'll stop here, but I recognize that we're probably not group-centered people in software design, but having that in mind it could be useful.
Evangeline?
Sorry, I have to be honest. I didn't read the paper, and as I'm glancing through it, it brings to mind that I need to review a lot of my statistics that I learned about 40 years ago or so. So I can't really comment much on the paper. Sorry.
Okay, thank you. Evangeline does QA on CODAP. So I have my reaction. In addition to the things that people have said, I found the paper very exciting. And here I am. And the thing that kept coming back to me was that in the 2.5 years of development of CODAP, it has been very seldom that I've been working with data that one could call a sample. And that therefore, these techniques don't apply to the data that I've been working with the Ocean Tracks group. It does apply to the Terra Populus group, but the citizen science folks and so on. It's just not very often that it's a sample. And that therefore how we deal with having these techniques always present everywhere might get in the way for those folks. But there is uncertainty and variability in scientific data, measurements. And so how do we bring similar techniques to people who are dealing with measurements or other kinds of scientific data so that they can get a sense of the variability? Because usually they just ignore it completely. Whereas in statistics, it's at the center of what we do. For scientific investigations, it's not.
I was wondering that, Bill, about, we had this issue with ocean tracks data where students were looking at, the average speed of the two animals, for example, or something like that, and trying to decide whether, well, yeah, these are really faster. This animal is really faster than that other one. Well, how do they make that argument?
Yeah. Okay, so good job, everybody, being brief. And come back to Amelia. You might want to give some reactions to what you heard, but then take us where you think would be productive.
Okay. Well, I think the first thing that I want to respond to is what Corey was saying about classrooms and groups, because that really sparked something in my mind. Like, I think it's really powerful to think about how that experience could be embodied. And I've actually found in my teaching, I teach randomization and bootstrap methods in my intro stat class, and then I'm teaching our multiple regression class. I teach it in this class as well. And they're hard concepts to grasp, maybe because I don't show much animation because I'm doing things in R. But I've found that it's easier if you can get people to actually do it themselves. So, hand out a bunch of note cards and have people write down some piece of information about themselves and try to compute some, like the linear relationship between their, well, you wouldn't have them write down their weight, but their height and their weight, and then collect all the cards, shuffle them up, hand them back out, and try and compute that same thing using the randomized data. I think that gives you a very intuitive sense of, I'm holding someone else's card. There's no reason why, the Y variable about me and the X variable about the person randomly in class with me, why those would be linked. And so that's been useful. The bootstrap is a little bit more complicated because if you have real people, you can't do sampling with replacement because once you've sampled someone, you can't get them to go stand over in the corner another time. So I haven't figured out an embodied way to do that. But I think it's true that if you could see it as something that was happening to elements that somehow had some relation to you or to real things, that might help. And yeah, I mean, I think I'm very sold on randomization and the bootstrap, as you could see from the paper. And so I would be interested to talk more about, the things that Rob and Bill both said. Rob didn't get very much into his skepticism, but I think that that could be a really important thing to talk about. Maybe it would convince me that randomization is not what we should be doing, or more hopefully from my perspective, maybe it would help strengthen some of the ideas to try and avoid whatever skepticism he has. And the same with Bill. I think I believe that, like Dan was saying, even when it's not a random sample, people want to make statements about, this animal is really faster than that animal. And that's something that randomization could help you do. Even if it's not a random sample, you could break the relationship between the animal and their speed and see what it would look like if there was no relationship, and compare that to the relationship that you actually observed. So I think those were my major responses.
So I know that Rob is not the only skeptic in the group with regard to randomization resampling techniques. So Rob, maybe you could elaborate a little more and open up the discussion around that. But you're muted.
So I'll give a kind of stream of consciousness take on that. So about this time last year, I did a workshop for community college teachers who are math teachers, and we did a randomization workshop. And we did several different exercises that involved them writing data on cards and then ripping the cards in two and keeping one label and shuffling everything. And we did this 2 or 3 times, and fortunately we had some pretty intelligent people who weren't afraid to ask questions, and it was pretty clear that doing it in the way I had been doing it did not convince these 3 or 4 people at all that this represented randomness. And it took a long time of answering their questions and getting details for them to really understand why this matched the null hypothesis. And so that was one sort of thing we thought, like, you know, somehow that dialogue had to be built in or classrooms, or it wasn't happening. And then recently I've witnessed several sorts of...
Just one moment, Ron. I believe Chad Dorsey has joined us. And hello, Chad.
Hi, I'm here. I'm in a mute, which I hadn't been doing. Sorry.
Yeah, well, that was the request I was going to make. Okay, go ahead, Rob.
Oh, yeah. So then I've watched a couple of workshops where this has happened, and I've been in the audience, and the workshops have happened kind of by using applets and saying, here we scramble, and the applets have animations and things shuffle around. But I've just kind of then scanned the room, and I don't see engagement. I see kind of blank stares of like, well, okay, I get it. I push this button, and then I write down the answer. And then on top of that, I mean, there was a recent art paper in Tice that did a randomized study at Iowa State, or one of the Iowas. And, you know, and they found that there wasn't any real difference between the students who they taught through the randomization approach and the ones they taught traditionally. You know, and so you can pick apart that sort of thing, but it wasn't, let's just say, in the best case scenario, there was no strong signal. And now kind of fast forward a little bit to some of the work I've been doing with high school teachers, and what I hear them saying that they love about coding, and we do randomization in this high school curriculum, as you know, Amelia. What they love about coding is it forces persistence, because they can't go on until they get it right. And the other thing is it makes them aware of, or at least it's made the teachers aware, that there's not just a single null hypothesis, that you have to make multiple decisions about what it is. And that makes for livelier classroom discussions where they actually can sometimes get involved in substantive materials about, well, what exactly are you claiming here? And I think all those sorts of things are lost when you're using applets. So I have a 2-part argument: is be careful about applets, and I'm still not sure how to teach randomization. I'm still not sure what students are really hearing when I'm doing randomization exercises with them.
Yes.
Can I ask a naive question?
Excuse me, Corey, were you raising your hand, Holly Lynn?
Oh, yeah. But you're muted.
I hear you.
Corey can go first, though. That's fine.
Okay.
Yeah, so this is a naive question, which is, it comes back, Amelia, to your initial point where you're not interested in probability, you're interested in stats. And I could just be, correct me, but it feels to me that if you were, so that one of the challenges for me in randomization is this idea that you're kind of privileging the assumption that you've got, and then you take the step of breaking the relation, where that's logically the same as building up the null hypothesis through a kind of, in the case of let's say you've got an unfair die and you're trying to show, and you're building the chi-square kind of test through this one of these things you called a pure probability sampler. Maybe the naive part of the question is can't we always do that kind of constructive null rather than the destructive null of breaking the relation? The constructive null that looks probabilistic and says if there wasn't a relation we would get something purely noisy, just noise, and then running the noise over and over. I think this was what, at least that's how I understood Cobb's argument that Tim was referring to.
So Tim raised his hand, I assume in response to Corey, is that correct?
But okay, Holly Lynn could go, but I'll go on this one. I think there are a couple different types of situations when you're doing the chi-squared kind of thing and you're saying, oh, is the die that I made like a fair die? Then we can make this equal probability model of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 and run it without any data. If, on the other hand, say you have 2 different groups and you're taking measurement variables on the 2 groups, and I'm making little box plots with my fingers in order to say, ooh, it looks like this one's higher than this one. This is a situation where we want to break the relationship between group membership and the value of the variable. And we can't easily do something from original probability because we have to use the actual data that we collected in order to create the sampling distribution of, say, the difference between the 2 means. And so that's the first thing that came to my mind as why that works in some circumstances and not in others.
So that seemed like, to me, a good answer to Corey's supposedly naive question. And did you want to say anything, Amelia, before we go to Holly Lynn?
No, I think what I would have said is very similar to what Tim said. If I had to generate null data about, the heights of men and women being actually different, well, then I'd have to generate a bunch of female and male labels randomly, and then I'd have to generate some heights randomly, but I'd have to pick, maybe they're normally distributed, and I'm going to pick them from a normal distribution. Like, I'm already making these sort of distributional assumptions, which I don't have to make if I just take the heights and the gender labels and mix up one of the columns.
Holly Lynn.
So my original hand raising was back whenever Rob was talking. I'm pointing this way because for me, Rob's this way. I think I agree with Rob that it is not obvious that people learn anything when they're doing different randomization, resampling kinds of techniques, depending on how it's done. And that, I worked really closely with Helen Dorr for a couple years, and she and I really tried very hard with and we were working with teachers, with groups of teachers to get them to, kind of understand all the different pieces and of what was actually happening. And then we thought we were doing this really, really great job. And we give them situation and we give them objects that they haven't dealt with before. And we say, okay, you build the model. Because even if, like what Rob was saying, I would have them do this, rip it in half, pass it around the room, he's still building the model. And I think that even when whether we're doing it technologically or on, by hand, at some point we have to get the kids in charge of, here's your situation. How would you do this? Yeah, and I think at that very core, when we're thinking about building a technological instantiation of this, that we have to keep in mind that they have to be the builders. And some of that I've learned a long time ago from Cliff as well.
That's cool. Because then even if they did something that made Tim gag, that's actually that's an exposed learning opportunity, right? Right. So if they're building it, then it's okay if they make crazy assumptions that then they have to defend and get shot down by their classmates on.
This also reminds me of those of us who are old enough. There is some book, which I can't remember the whole title of, The Art and Something of Designing Simulation, that came from that project that was in the Midwest. Cliff, were you on that project? I know it's like Gail Burrill and a couple other people, in which the whole point of all the exercises in the book was to do what Holly Lynn was saying, namely get the kids to make the probability model that models some phenomenon.
Right. So yesterday, Cliff and I were having a discussion about bootstrapping, and I claimed that bootstrapping had become, whereas originally I had the usual reaction to bootstrapping is like, that cannot work, but that it had become completely solid and intuitive to me. And Cliff was saying, no, it's not at all intuitive that it should work. In fact, I don't believe that it actually works, essentially. You can correct me or amplify Cliff. And Amelia,
I believe it works, but I don't understand how. My intuition is that if I repeatedly sample with replacement, that I'm going to, if I'm trying to get a sense of, for example, estimate the error in sampling distribution, my sense is I'm going to underestimate it. This is going to give me a biased estimator. So at some point, I need a proof to understand why this is why this gives me an unbiased estimate of the thing I'm estimating. And but I had never really done it before to test. Suppose I draw repeatedly from a known distribution, repeated samples, and look at the estimate, versus take one of those samples and sample with replacement and look at it. Will I get the same thing? And Bill and I actually did that both yesterday. Rob, you want to save me from embarrassing myself further?
you're muted, Rob.
Oh, no, I would never want to save you from that. Yeah, I guess what I would say, you know, I'm actually a skeptic on teaching bootstrapping in the classroom still, because, you know, everyone says that the percentile confidence interval is so easy to understand. And it's really, really hard to understand because basically what you have to argue is, and I just tried this last week with some, you know, senior students and failed miserably. I mean, basically because I tried to do it in one day, and that's a mistake. But you basically have to argue that when you say there's a 95% chance that you're talking about taking a sample from the population, resampling 1,000 times, then taking another sample from the population and resampling 1,000 times, and looking at infinitely many bootstrap samples, and then, you know, the probability that any one of them, you know, captures the interval is 95%. So you're still stuck with that hard concept that we have with confidence intervals. That doesn't go away at all. All that you've eliminated is an equation. You know, so, well, and you've gained a lot of ability to apply this technique more than you can with the equation. But that's not, I'm not convinced it's worth, that ability is worth the cost. I don't find it that much easier to teach or to understand.
So, Amelia,
but that has to do with, sounds like, with understanding a confidence interval more than bootstrapping itself.
Oh yeah, I think so. I think so. But I mean, bootstrapping is a procedure, and it's easy to explain the procedure. Mm-hmm. It's hard to explain the procedure that produces the confidence interval formula. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, the procedure is easier to understand, but understanding how to get the procedure to the percentile confidence interval and what that means is still hard, still complex.
So, yes, Tim.
For me, when I have taught this to high school students using Bootstrap, I avoid the question is, what does it actually mean? And that's the hard thing, right? And so if instead, well, we called it a plausibility interval, and say, so what's kind of the 90% range of what seems like might turn out to be the mean of this population? And we know it could be outside, but if we're gonna put some sort of range on it, this seems reasonable. Students seem to be able to go with that, but we have to admit that they don't understand, having done that, what the official confidence interval is. And I was willing to give up on that because I was convinced there was no condition under which they would fully understand what the confidence was. And it wouldn't matter for their futures. So I was okay.
So Amelia, one way to interpret these comments, some of them at any rate, is that is a refutation of your plan that we should make randomization techniques ubiquitously available in CODAP. And I think you should respond to that.
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts. So I think the main one is I agree pretty wholeheartedly with Rob. I have tried teaching randomization and the Bootstrap a bunch of times now, and it isn't entirely clear to me what the students get from it. I think the most heartening evidence that I have is on an exam, at least once or maybe twice, I came up with a statistic that I wanted some sort of quasi-inferential statement to be made about. And I asked the students, I gave them a whole bunch of space, write out how you would use randomization to see, if this relationship was really different than 0 or whatever. And many students were able to write a list of steps that seemed to me would answer that question, which I think sort of speaks to Holly Lynn's point of having the students generate the model themselves, which I think is really important. I think I buy Rob's argument that code maybe makes it a little bit more like you're going to be having to do this thing that Holly Lynn's talking about of making the model yourself than an applet would, because an applet just does what it's going to do when you push the button. But yeah, even with all that, it's not clear what students are getting out of it. I guess my argument is that even when I teach a more traditional statistics course where we're relying on the normal distribution or the T distribution, the F distribution, distributions, and learning a bunch of different formulas, I'm not sure what the students take away from that either. I think statistics is really hard. And if we have to pick one of those two things to try and teach with technology, I think that simulation methods are better.
Holly Lynn.
So I don't want to harp on this, but I just want to bring up, the whole idea with the coding. I agree. So I think that model building and coding I take those as the same thing. I mean, you have to instantiate your model in some way. And one of the things we can learn from is if you think about some of the designs that our computer science friends have really kind of enacted with things like Scratch and Alice. I mean, drag and drop kinds of coding where you put something in and you're building your logic, and you just have to change a few parameters and you understand those. I mean, I think that they don't have to be R coding to be coding.
Dan.
Did you say Dan or Tim?
I said Dan.
Okay.
I didn't see if Tim had his hand.
The two short one-syllable names here, the hard consonant at the beginning. So the thing that I would like to see in CODAP are some set of tools that will help students construct arguments about conclusions that they are making. They're stating some claim based on the data they have in front of them, And now they want to say that I think this is true. And right now, what they do is they look at two mean lines for distributions, and if they are not identical, then they're different. Right? And we don't have anything now that helps them with that. Now, so then the question is, what are the kinds of things that we could add? And it seems like the kinds of things we could add would be the standard kind of error bar kinds of things that we could automatically generate. We could add things where they are doing some kind of statistical modeling, like with this randomization techniques and the bootstrapping techniques. We could potentially add, depending on the system, you could add a thing where you've got a model that's, idealized model that's generating some data that allows them to compare the data they're looking at. There's lots of different things here that we potentially could do, and maybe depending on the scenario, one thing is a better thing to do than another. I did really like this. For me, statistics has always been confounding as well. I've done education research and tried to make claims about whether the innovation we've done has made a difference or not. And I've always felt uneasy about the claims I've been able to make in terms of wondering whether these, it's statistic, it's significant, it has some, what's the word I'm looking for? The size effect size, these kinds of things, which in many ways still feel magical to me when I plug in the numbers and get some numbers out. So I would love for us to both be able to support having students understand and provide evidence for and make reason about why they are making a claim. And sometimes that might be highly scaffolded and where they're doing lots of modeling, and other times it might be they want to push a button and get some confidence intervals that, they've been through the procedure of understanding what these things mean, and now they just want to generate them.
So, Tim, did you have a comment?
Yeah, but I think I'll store it for another time.
Okay, I want to do a demo because reading Amelia's paper caused me to prototype something in CODAP. And here it is. So you see the famous cats, the 24 cats, and I'm going to say start bootstrapping. And now I'm going to put median on there. So I guess that would be an example of what we mean by making bootstrapping randomization ubiquitously available.
So this looks to me like randomization and not the bootstrap, because well, maybe not, because it's just one variable. So
I can do it.
Bootstrapping would be recording that mean in some other place, right? And then recording the distribution of that.
Yeah, I guess so. Now tail length is staying the same. So weight is getting mixed up, but tail length is not.
Tail length, this is a bootstrap in that the 24 cats are sampled with replacement and then plotted.
So what's happening in the table?
We're seeing in the table that only weight is around.
That looks like a bug. Oh, I know what I was supposed to stop bootstrapping before I did the graph. Yeah. All right, let's see if it works now. Sorry, I forgot the limits. There we go.
Cool.
But even so, it looks like, Tomodachi Jodo there is having his weight and tail length shuffled. It doesn't look like we're sampling from cats.
Well, they are shuffled together.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, it would be great if everything about the whole row, like if you saw Tomodachi Jodo appearing several times in there, instead of leaving the name column and the gender sort of solid, if you saw the whole observation being sampled. And
Good idea. Let's close the table.
perfect.
So
I love
Bill, to make sure I'm using the vocabulary right, you were bootstrapping, but just treating those two columns as the case and kind of ignoring the rest.
Yeah.
What people are asking for is bootstrapping, where you treat the whole case as the thing that's being resampled.
Well, why isn't this randomization?
And it sounds like it is. It's an interesting way that randomization and bootstrapping could be made to seem as related to each other. That is, the thing that Bill did when he did it only on one column was randomization when you cared about the other one, right? Or no?
No. Well, I mean, it would be randomization if it were sampling without replacement.
But that's what it was doing. It felt like it was.
Well, that's what it looks like it was doing, but then he told us that it wasn't really doing that. So that's why we were.
Oh, okay.
All right, and
that's why he closed the table.
In my at least my naive understanding of what bootstrapping might be that we're recording the slope or something, slope and of that in another table, and then recording the variation in that, and that would give us our something.
That would give us a bootstrapped sampling distribution,
Yeah.
which would be centered around, if it was for the slope, for example, it would be centered around the slope, the estimated slope that we had from the original data. But we could do that same thing with randomization. We could randomize tail length, so break the relationship between weight and tail length, and do that a bunch of times and record the slope in another table and that would build a randomized sampling distribution. That distribution would be centered around 0 because most of the time it would be a flat slope. We assume there's no relationship, but sometimes it would be negative, sometimes it would be positive, and we would see that our observed slope probably was weird on that distribution versus being centered in the middle. That's the distinction. They both make sampling distributions, but they have different centers. Right.
So one of our design problems, it seems to me then, is if we want to be able to collect, because I'm a Fathom guy, I have to use Fathom vocabulary. But you were just talking about, okay, here we are watching a bootstrap phenomenon, and what we would like to do is to collect the measures from this bootstrap phenomenon or collect measures from a sampling phenomenon and put them in some other table. And so is that really what we want to do? And if so, what's the kind of gesture or something we can do to make clear what we're doing and how to specify what are the quantities that are going to be collected in this new thing? And so I think the first question is that really what we want to do? Because that's kind of what we designed in Fathom through the measures mechanisms. And if we want to reproduce that simplifies our thinking, but it may not be what we want.
So in the Tinkerplots interface, the way we did that was to be able to sort of, from any graph, have a bunch of things that you can click on and say, I want to keep a history of that value as it changes. And that puts it in that new table. So that's just a quick gesture without having to write a formula. Hey, track the slope of this line and put that in a new data table.
So,
but I think that what both Tim and Cliff are saying is, so it's done differently in Fathom and Tinkerplots, but I think the question that I heard Tim asking is that what we want? To have all that history, that collection stored somewhere else? Is that the most logical place to put it? And is it cognitively kind of what's going to make the most sense to students?
And
I don't know, but I'm just trying to reiterate that I think that's the question Tim was asking.
And I came to the realization that even without collecting those measures, that there was some value in seeing the bootstrapping happen in the plot. that it was a way of giving the learner a sense of how much variability there could be with a sample like that. Of course, it comes back, for me, it comes back to, wait a minute, this is not a random sample of cats, and what do we mean by variability? There is no variability, but that's perhaps the next discussion that we could have.
So with this brings me back again to my trying to get students to understand what an orbital is as a probability map for where you find electrons and sort of different density of color. Like you could imagine that this is that mean distribution line is like 50% translucent, and it actually is stamping every time it changes the distribution. Then you would end up with one of those gradient type displays of, yeah, well, it's mostly here and it's less likely out here, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Sketchpad had a notion of traces.
Yeah.
That could have lifetime, and they could fade over time, and so on and so forth, that if applied to that would give that effect.
Yeah, when you described that original problem of the students thinking that they're the same or not, I flipped the same way in my head, instantly thought about error bars, and then realized how completely insufficient those are for people who aren't used to them, and thought about some kind of a gradient or I don't know what it is, but that echoed for me too.
So Chad, I think there might be a couple of people who don't know you. Can you introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Chad. I'm on phone, but I could probably be on video as well if you want to see me. I'm we'll see if it comes. Hi, here I am. I'm on my way to Emeryville right now. I'm president of Concord Consortium. Thrilled to be here and know probably 2/3 of you, but the others of you I should meet at some point, but I won't do that now.
Okay.
Yeah, and just because we're talking about gradients, I think that is one way that people have shown variability, and I think that it's good. I don't think I actually cited it here, I'm looking at my references, but there's a paper, Error Bars Considered Harmful, that came from IEEE Viz, which is essentially about how people are not very good at understanding error bars, especially if you have a bar chart and then here's the top of the bar chart and then this is the error bar around it. People think that this is the possibility. They neglect to see that there's also the sort of the bottom part. They just see the above the mean. And so, people use box plots, they use violin plots, and then I think the hypothetical outcome plots that Jessica Hallman is talking about have been shown to be a little bit better than these other ways of showing variability.
So Amelia, you there was a point where people, I think Bill put it as, are we taking this as a refutation of your claim that we should put randomization in the Bootstrap everywhere? And I think the conversation moved on without you getting to say, no, I don't. But it struck me in your writing that you weren't saying, well, maybe I was just trying to recuperate it, that you weren't saying that these techniques need to be ready and ever present, but there is a kind of inquiry verb that needs to be ready to hand, which you want. So one way to think about what you're arguing for as a gesture is a thing that you might want to do a lot, which sometimes would lead to a bootstrap and sometimes would lead to something else, but would be something like let this vary, or compare with something else. Right? So if you reduce it to an action that you might want to take in a lot of cases, and that might be a kind of primitive action in statistical inquiry, then it starts to be both a block-like thing you can put in a programming language and a gesture-like thing you can put in an interface. Is there something like that you want to propose?
Well, I just want to second what you just said. I think that's certainly how I feel about it, that it should be something that's close at hand and general, and you could use to help you like Dan is saying, make some conclusion. It's sort of your toolkit for being able to argue statistically. And I do think that it should include randomization on the Bootstrap, but if there was something else that seemed like it was more intuitive or easier for people to understand or more rigorous or whatever it was, yeah, I think I'm not as particular about the method by which we do that. But I don't have any brilliant ideas about how to make it seem like it's all one thing.
Well, so in your reactions, Amelia, you singled out the skepticism about Bootstrap or randomization techniques, sampling techniques, and the point that not all data is a sample. And I wonder if you could talk more about the utility of these methods when the data do not come from a random sample of anything.
Yeah, I will admit that I'm a little underprepared for this conversation. I meant to go reread this great book that I read in graduate school about how to use Bootstrap techniques in a variety of situations, some of which are non-random samples. So I didn't do that prep. I guess what I'll say is, so you gave us that demo with the cats, and we looked at the relationship between their tail length and their weight, and it looked like the relationship was the directionality that we would expect. Heavier cats also have longer tail lengths. I think that's what we saw, although maybe not. Maybe I'm just projecting. And I think that it's not as clear to me what you would get from bootstrapping that data, but I can see easily what you could get from doing randomization on that data. Is I observed that there is some positive relationship in this data between tail length and weight, but is that just the result of the cats that I happen to, not randomly, but see to observe, and what if I mixed up some, everyone's tail lengths so that they had their own weights but they had someone else's tail length? Would I still see would I still get that positive relationship pretty frequently if I did that a bunch of times? Or is the relationship that I observed at such a magnitude that it seems like that was really different than randomness?
Rob, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I did, I guess. I mean, the message I'm coming to from all this discussion, which was seeded by Holly Lynn, is this importance of thinking about modeling. And I was just wondering if it would be nice to talk about what we're talking about now in the context of Dan's question about how should students determine what dolphin, I'm assuming they're dolphins or seals or something, is faster. I mean, what does a student mean when they say this? Because at the face of it, why do you need statistics to answer that question? You've just seen two tracks. Okay, now. So I think that's a modeling question. Is how are you modeling the concept of fastness?
Joachim?
Yeah. Well, I think we have seen wonderful examples, and the example that Bill demonstrated was really very nice. And we all agree that technology can really help to understand the procedure, what we are doing. But the more we discuss, the longer we discuss here, I think there's still a gap that technology cannot fill. Giving a meaning to that. What does that really mean? What do all these scatter plots with these different slopes of regression lines, why do we have that? Yeah? I mean, that comes down to the question, what kind of inference is possible? And how do we justify that inference that we are claiming to do with the bootstrap? And by the way, and the randomization technique with the scrambling has a completely different type of inference. that needs a different justification. And that's not easy to grasp. And I wonder, I mean, it's wonderful what technology can do here with the illustrations, and it may not be really that much important if you take down and your different slopes and make a new distribution of slopes or not. It's wonderful just to see how that differs, but maybe more important than the quantitative analysis, that may really be a secondary question. The main question is, how can you teach what that means?
So on that note, I'd like us to take a short break and come back.
Everything.
Come back and address either Joachim's question, how can we teach what that means, or other questions that might be on people's minds. But this is a longish meeting, and so we need to have a break in the middle. So let's be back here at 15 after the hour, whatever hour you happen to be. Tim, you said something.
So 3 minutes we have.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just time enough.
And this meeting not only goes till noon-ish, a little
It
shorter.
goes 10 out. Yeah.
Have a cookie. I brought some Christmas cookies.
Oh boy.
So people are coming back. That's good. I gave just 3 minutes, knowing it would be at least 5 before everyone got back.
Jonathan?
Yes.
Thank you for that sample. I haven't had a chance to dig into it, but I will this afternoon.
Right.
So please tell Lennon to feel free to contact me if there's any, if he's having any problems.
And,
Absolutely.
And you should know that Jonathan is on vacation from
The 16th, next Friday.
16th through the following week.
27th.
Yeah. So that may be a conflict for Lennon.
Or an incentive.
But if it's short, I can, you know, I'll be checking my email sometime.
No. Pretend that you're not. I like the incentive part of that.
Okay. We're waiting for Dan and Rob. And there's Rob. How's this going for people?
Very interesting.
Yeah, it's good.
I haven't done enough of this medium-sized Zoom conference. I'm still kind of blown away that we can do it.
It does work pretty well.
And you know, an advantage of having everybody on the screen is I can see everybody all at once. But then sometimes Amelia is speaking and she's moved on my screen and I can't find her.
That was when we only move as if people are being added and removed, and so it was Chad coming and going.
Yes, that was the
throwing it
story.
off.
Okay, so when we broke, there was Joachim's question of, but how do we get people to understand what it really means? And then there's the question of how do we propose integrating this with CODAP? And then there's the question of, but wait a minute, not all data are random samples. So what do we do about that? And I leave it to you, Amelia, to lead us.
Well, I realized that one way that I can just kick the problem of random samples down the road is that I think both Corey and Holly Lynn mentioned, like, if students are creating their own models and then have to justify them, sometimes they might create a model which is hard to justify. So maybe even though the features were available all the time, a student might say, I'm gonna, I think that bootstrapping is the sort of model that I want to use to try and make some inference about some relationship or statistic or something, and then they wouldn't be able to justify their use of it. It would sort of break down under, like Joachim is saying, the kind of the understanding what people really mean. Once they start saying, how does this relate to the problem at hand? How do I justify what I'm using?
I just realized I have something to bring in thinking about variability in scientific data. So we've got these 24 cats, and we have measured their weights and their tail lengths. But, of course, there's error in those measurements. And we may know the error associated with the device we were using or the error associated with the process we were using to do those measurements. If we have an estimate of that error, then the real question is, we observed this correlation between body weight and tail length, but maybe how much error is associated with that correlation? And now we can use simulation to draw measurements from the distribution of possible measurements we would get given that error and see the variability in the correlation. And that might be a way that these kinds of simulation techniques come to bear on situations where there is no random sample. We're not trying to make a claim about the population of cats. We're trying to make a claim about this group of cats. Tim.
And yet, if we have those cats and we have their measurements in two variables and we scramble one of them, now I'm not talking about Bootstrap, we scramble one of them and we collect, say, correlation coefficients, and we compare that distribution of null hypothesis correlation coefficients to our observed test statistic correlation coefficient, then I'm going to pose the question to Rob. So, because Rob, you're one of the actual statisticians, I'm certainly not. It seems to me that we can say something about the importance, I'm not going to say significance because maybe that's not exactly the right thing, but the relevance of our particular correlation coefficient, even though this is not a random sample of cats. What is it that we can actually say? Because that doesn't use the error in the measurements, which I think is also very interesting, that we could tweak the errors in the measurements and see how that affects the correlation coefficient. But if we go back to the scramble, what does it actually tell us?
Yeah, well, and this goes back to the question about which dolphin is actually the fastest dolphin.
Exactly. Right.
Well, Cliff once said to me, see how I've deftly deflected this question. You can always ask, is this due to chance?
Mm-hmm.
And so the question there is, what's the this? And in that case, I would say that this is those cats. I mean, and this comes up all the time when we talk about controlled studies in statistics. There's no medical study in the world that has ever used a random sample of patients. So we're not claiming that that this drug lowers blood pressure for everyone. We're claiming that in this one trial, it actually lowered blood pressure, and caveat emptor after that. So I think, building on what Amelia said, I mean, it's the difference between learning to say, in this case, is chance one of the explanations that produced the structure that we see, but reasoning beyond that is another thing entirely.
And so I would be very happy if a student made that argument about, there is a relationship between tail length and weight, and put into what Dan was talking about, if there were some mechanism by which we can record our claims and the evidence that we were using to support them.
But I'll just say the reason you'd be very, very happy is it's really, really hard to get that to happen. And the reason it's really hard is where the hell does the chance come from those 24 cats? And measurement error is one thing. I think
you have to make the assumption. If you make the assumption that the cats were not selected on the basis of that observed correlation, but on some other, either they were convenience or something else, as long as they weren't selected on that, then I think it's reasonable to sort of claim that this observed difference or correlation came about by chance, because I wasn't at all selecting on it. If on the other hand I was, there's no way to answer how likely it was due to chance, right? And many things are like that. We collect data, but we're not paying attention to values of any variables when we do it.
But I guess I'm thinking from the other point of view, and this goes way beyond, or this maybe isn't really tied to how to develop tools, but why does a student look at two tracks of seals and what's wrong with them saying this one is faster? I mean, there's only a sample size as 2 or something, and what's wrong with them looking at 24 cats and saying, of course there's a slope because I see the slope and there's, So in addition to Cliff's wise comment there, you can always say something's due to chance. I also have a former colleague's thing in my mind all the time saying, do you do significant tests for your checkbook when you balance your checkbook? And the answer is sometimes I do, actually.
You balance your checkbook?
But his point is that if there's a difference of 4 cents, there's really a difference of 4 cents. You don't need to do a significance test in that case. So
yeah, I do want to bring out, so let me be more specific about my example, because what I think we really need is some worked examples of here's the thing, here's a data set, and here's the claim that we would like students to be able to make or support from the data set. And for me, it's pretty hard to do this all abstractly. I would love to see several worked examples and think about what would be the kinds of things we need to support people. But in this 4 seals one, the more specific thing was you had measurements of speed and depth and sea surface temperature and chlorophyll measurements and a measure of curviness, and you also had their locations, so you could see their positions on a map. So one of the things is you might on the map say, well, looks like there's a cluster of interesting dots over here. Is something different happening in this cluster of dots compared to some other random selection of dots on the map, right? And so now you're actually you've got to make a claim that I think, well, yeah, the fact that they're clustered together here, at least visually for me, is important, and I can support it because I have these other measures of what's going on with the animals. And if I compare some statistical measurement, some aggregate measurement about what's going on in this part of the map to some other place and say it really is different, well, how do I make that claim? I mean, in some ways you're saying, well, if the numbers are different, they're different. But I feel like, well, are they different enough really to make the claim that they're different?
Right, and I would feel better if the student scrambled and used that as a means of saying how real it was, although I'm not sure what the underlying statistical oomph is behind that because it's not a random sample. Holly Lynn.
All right, so I'm glad. So the point that I was going to make actually was stemming from something that Amelia said a long time ago, but then I think stuff that Bill said and that Tim said kind of, I can tie this together, I think. But so let's say whether we have data or anything, if we, going back to the idea of building a model, I really think that the conception that I think is fruitful for the student to think about is what in this context could be repeated. What is possible to be repeated? And so with Tim's example of, that I want them to scramble, well, it's weights and tails. Well, what could be repeated in that situation? And I think that might be harder to conceive of, well, I guess I could repeat, constructing this cat of so many weights and then attaching a tail to it, and they have to kind of conceive of that at that level as to why it would make sense to scramble the tails in the first place. And with Bill's example, with with measurements, and that there being error there, that there is this sense of, okay, well I'm measuring tails, or I'm measuring whatever. I do have to repeatedly. I can imagine that I measured this tail, and if somebody else measured this tail, they might get slightly different answers. And so I think, and anytime we want them to do any type of technique, they have to envision something about that as a process that can be repeated. And if we quickly jump into repeating the process for them without giving them the opportunity to conceive of what needs to be repeated, I think we've lost them.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wonder what people how people would react to this. So take the seals case. Scrambling seems like something, if you sort of order the probability of what a student would do, scrambling seems very to violate context. Like you wouldn't think of, it's not something you could do in the world, is take the seals, whatever the attributes that they had, and mix them, or take the tails from the cats. But what you would imagine doing is saying, if the claim is that geography matters for this attribute, you could imagine them saying, well, how many seals are in that geography? 25, 28, and how many seals do we know about? 150. So taking samples of 28 from the whole population and doing that over and over that's the repeatable thing that I could imagine being accessible to the kid, would lead them to be able to make, or at least that would be a good beginning for saying, does geography matter? Right? But I don't feel like, I feel like the kind of frame of this conversation is how to make something that is an accepted technique accessible to kids, rather than to build from, like, is there a way to build from that intuition about something that is repeatable to go then, can we get from there to breaking the relation in a set of smooth steps and activities, or is that is our intuitions like that we can observe kids doing recruitable for a direction that we want them to go?
Yeah, I don't know how much research there has been about students' intuitions in these sort of randomization contexts. I'm guessing that Holly Lynn probably knows as well as anyone on this call. So thinking about that example, though, I'm not sure, that's not a way that I would use the Bootstrap to answer a statistical question. So if I had 100 seals and I was going to sample with replacement 28 of them and then find their average depth, I don't know how doing that repeatedly, like, what am I going to find about the average depth that's going to let me say something about that geographic group?
Well, if I understood what he was saying, it's that if I sample these average depths repeatedly and I get 1,000 meters, but my test group that's all clumped together has an average depth of 100 meters, and the 1,000-meter group, and that distribution doesn't even come close to 1 meters because I never happened to sample those 28, then I would say, oh, there's something special about these 28. Is that what you were possibly thinking?
But I'd point out, too, that randomization still makes sense here. You could also just as easily take those geographic labels and shuffle them around and get the same result, saying, these are the seals, and you're questioning whether geography matters, and so let's posit a world in which geography doesn't matter. And we do that by shuffling the labels, the geographical locations around, and see if we get the same result.
Yeah,
So how do we get students? Is there a conceptual and a technological way to get students to ask that question? Because it seems like you're always the one telling them that that's the question. I don't know.
I agree, yeah.
I remember a teacher workshop in which we had just done, we were partway through a scrambling, and I stopped and I said, okay, what's the question we're trying to answer? Nope.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think, so in some part, saying, is this due to chance is a learned response. So you're not going to, very few people will come up with that question on their own for many different reasons. So, I mean, in some part, that's just got to be a canned response. But then the other issue then is how do we enable a modeling of that situation of what do you mean by chance? I mean, I can think of another chance model for this situation, which would be to ask the question, how different in the speeds of these seals at two locations does it get to be before a human notices enough difference to say, I have a hypothesis? I mean, so that's another level to that as well, which I could maybe simulate or model. So there's two different issues there. One is this old issue we have. How do we get that reflex of students to ask that? Then the other is how do we enable their ability to answer it?
So this is a seminar about simulation, and headed towards what should be its role in CODAP. So let's spend the last part of this thinking more particularly about what we would like to bring into CODAP and how. And I gave one example, not very complete prototype, but what do people see? What do you imagine?
So I just want to give a quick reaction to what you showed us, Bill. While those of us that even understood bootstrapping were first a little confused, I think I think the ease of capability of being able to just click a button and have that happen scares the hell out of me.
Say more.
I think kids will see that as a game to play. I'm not sure that they will see it as something to investigate statistically in the instantiation that it is right now. And I completely realized it was just something you threw together to put us there into the conversation space. Yeah, that kind of interface, there was no modeling involved.
Yeah, but on the other hand, I found the video that Tim shared of the demonstration of bootstrapping in Fathom very helpful for me in understanding what bootstrapping is and what it means from a learner point of view. So I would argue that maybe, well, button isn't possible. Maybe some way of like demonstrating it in a more immersive way could be possible.
Holly Lynn, were you made afraid or terrified or nauseous or whatever by the fact that the what if was indistinguishable from the this, right? Like, so one of the things when you can, the nudge tool where you can change the data bothers people sometimes in that the data is the thing and you're trying to think on the data, but you're not trying to change it. If when you did Bill's thing, it made it on a copy or on an alternate universe kind of thing, without harming the original data, would that solve some of the problem? Or
I think that is part of it. That there was this you were acting on something that was there already without seemingly potentially much thought. And it did help once the table was closed, because I didn't understand what was going on with the table, But yeah, I mean, I think that there would have to be a lot more kind of visualization of what kind of going to kind of sampler types of things of, okay, what's actually being sampled, what's being sucked up here, how many times did that one cat actually show up here, and I would assume that if I would have stopped the bootstrapping and clicked on one of those dots, I don't know, like, how would I have been able to see in that original table how many times, if that case only appeared once or if that case was actually there 3 or 4 times? I don't know. So.
Yeah.
Did other people have this distress feeling? Rob says to everyone, oh, you're giving us a link, Rob, is that correct?
Yeah, I was going to type stuff in to not interrupt the flow, but so I don't know how many people have seen the Lock family's applets, but as far as applets go, I think they're a really good illustration of bootstrapping, but I don't think applets go very far, but as far as they go, this is, I think, pretty good if you want to check it out.
Yeah, I'm realizing I thought I had linked the Lock 5 stat key applets, but I think I only linked the Rossman Chance one, so thank you. Yeah, I think for me, certainly like having the original data be sort of almost sacred. Like, you can't mess with the original data. That is what we observed, and we want to preserve it because we're going to compare things about that real data to our simulated data. And so, having it appear in another table seems really important. Having it be another color, or not being as opaque, or it sort of disappearing, like these sorts of interface choices that make you feel like, that's just some ephemeral thing that I've generated, and it's not as real as the original data. I think that's important.
Even if your original data was created by a sampler, right? Like it's a different gesture that you're making, or a different frame of mind. You're taking this as the observed, and now you're saying what could have happened.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, like, I haven't looked at the oceans of data site in a long time in the CODAP with the seals and all, but like, I guess I'm kind of thinking, like, wouldn't it be cool if we could help students create alternative worlds? So I mean, because basically that's what we're talking about, and so there's a lot of levels of modeling going on here. And so as Dan, as you described the problem, it was kind of like the data had already been collected and each seal had a speed or something, but that speed also came from some tracks that I think they can observe in some views of the data. And wouldn't it be great if they could create alternative models that's saying, I want this guy to be the fastest dolphin or seal. Now let's see how this might have played out. And then I want to have speed be random. And so in the background, there's this random seals swimming at different speeds, but you also always have your actual data overlaid somehow. So you're not really maybe able to make any conclusions right that, because you still have to measure it, and you still have to capture what their average speed or something was. But somehow fundamentally there's a way of seeing a less abstract visualization of the world as it would happen by chance or something.
Tim.
So I was not as frightened as Holly Lynn was by what we saw. And the particular thing that I liked about it, and I agree maybe it does belong in a different graph, or as Amelia was saying, just distinguished somehow importantly, but even that didn't bother me. I thought it was really great how we were able to see the variability in time very easily. Now, exactly what we were seeing might require some instruction. And when we had our break, my wife, as I was making my Ovaltine, my wife said, I really like what Cliff said, that sometimes things are just hard. And that's really true. And I think we have to remember that. I'm now going to pick up a little bit of what I was maybe going to say earlier. I think my students actually understood randomization. I don't have good evidence for it, but I will point out that each time I had them for an entire year, right? So we went over a lot about what does the randomization actually mean, so that by the end, when they were trying to figure out whether two things were really different or not exactly really different, I think they were giving me, of course I may be dreaming it, but I think they were giving me good reasons why they were choosing a scramble instead of, say, using random numbers to generate something or something like that, and what it was they were actually measuring. And look, see how our number is way outside the distribution. That kind of language came up. And so anyway, Bill's question is, how should we get this into CODAP? I really like the fast thing. I still have no idea how or whether we really want to collect those into some other data set. And I really worry in CODAP's case, as I would in Fathom's case, just how much screen space have we got? How many tables can we afford to have on the screen? And how will we indicate to the viewer which table is sort of where in the sequence of data production that there might be?
Raising my own hand, Bill. I would argue that it might be an advantage not to put the bootstrapped or scrambled data in a separate plot, partly because of what Tim just described, but also because then you're creating the question is, well, what are these data? And now you have to distinguish between these bootstrap data and the original data. And there's something really nice about the evanescent quality of these points moving around. And maybe there's a way to make it so that the learner doesn't treat that as anything like the real data, but still leave it in the same place, because then they don't have another thing to figure out. They just have a manifestation of the original thing to figure out. And instead of so if you're going to have this next level of let's collect the slopes, then we have 3 levels if we're doing it in three different places, and that's the way Fathom did it. And man, that was tough for people. And so if I can keep it to 2 levels and I'm just pulling those slopes out and building up a distribution with those, maybe that would be easier. I mean, I regard the statistical inference simulation in Fathom as a good effort, but not something that was ever shown to be able to teach those concepts. And I see Corey and then Tim.
So maybe there's some kind of game that the dots play that you can. So I'm thinking about your case about the if you said take into account measurement error, then a kind of thing that you'd expect a visual representation to do is kind of the dots just wiggle, the dots vibrate, right? And the animation is kind of easy to imagine. But in this scramble case, you can imagine them kind of moving from where they really are to the new one, to the alternate place, and then back to their, like if they kind of always went home to where the real data was, they or a ghost of them could go and vary. In some cases, that might be destructive of understanding, because it would suggest that the before and after of the scramble mattered. But in some cases, it might something that animated the data, and then you'd stop animating, right? So that they would come back to home where they really were, and stop being in their alternate universe.
Tim?
So one of the things from what you were saying that made me think of is, so if you have what we had called in the past a bootstrap collection or a scrambled collection or something like that, that's characterized partly by having exactly the same structure as the original data. It has the same attributes, it has the same number of, or some number of cases, but the table looks kind of the same. Similarly, the graph we want to see looks the same as the graph. It has the same attributes on the axes. So it's almost as if you want to be able to peel the layer of fantasy away and see the real data, and then you can put the layer of fantasy back, which may be translucent in some way. So you can still see the real data, but you're watching the changing, sampled or bootstrapped or whatever it is things. Whereas the slopes or the means or the speeds or whatever it is that we're pulling out of the sample, that table is structured differently and actually has to be a different table. So that may help save the screen space of that intermediate table or the intermediate graph. The other thing that occurred to me when Holly-Lynn was saying we had to close the table is that when you're doing scrambling or you're doing bootstrapping, in a way, dare we suggest maybe the animation needs to be in the table. If you could actually see the rows moving around or some of those things moving around, maybe that would help understand what's actually happening with the data in a way that flying blue balls didn't actually tell people what was going on.
Yes.
I really liked in in Amelia's slides, the video that you sent showing how the randomization occurs with the heights of people on the tug of war. Like, that really made it clear what's going on. You don't necessarily need to see that every single time, or I don't know, but some even if it's abstracted a little bit, but pulls that a part of that from the table, and then you see that scrambling happening.
So I want to bring this to a close because we said we would end at 10 of the hour, and it's now 10 of the hour. But a few parting comments, Cliff and then Holly Lynn.
Well, just these new thoughts got me to thinking about this playfulness about, I've produced some kind of graph, and students are somewhat familiar with graphs that show error bars of some sort. And what if these games basically produced on the graph that you're looking at through this kind of playing eventually some kind of error bars? So it was leaving a mark around, say, the heights of bars, but you were building that up over time through one of these simulations. So then you don't even need another table or graph. You're leaving a trace, you're building a trace or a set of noise, a distribution around two things you're thinking about. I'm just, the idea of trying to limit the amount of space and just trying to take one graph and add some stuff to it through this game that you play.
Holly Lynn.
Of a thought.
Yeah, I wanted to comment that I liked where this conversation was going as far as how to think about where our technological resources need to kind of match where cognitively we want students to kind of be thinking about this. And I like the ideas generated. Another idea that was coming up about this idea of, instead of peeling back, if there was some way to kind of preserve, and maybe it's not another window, but it's this window gets split. And so I get to preserve and see my original data always, but then up here is my playful land where I get to play and kind of see what's happening. I think one of the things that bothered me about the table, and it's somebody I think brought this up at some point, is that what I was visually seeing happening in the table didn't match conceptually what I thought was supposed to be happening. And so if we're going to honor multiple linked representations with this process, I think we have to make, if we choose for it to be able to happen in the table and in a graph at the same time, conceptually they have to match.
Yep. Okay. We're out of time. If you have suggestions for, I think we'll do this again in a couple of months, assuming Amelia's up for it. I think this worked very well, similar to the last time. If you have suggestions or comments about the way we're doing it, email me. I guess, is there anything you wanted to say, Amelia, as we close?
Well, it's not really a concluding thought, but Dan mentioned the video with my slides that I linked to, and I felt like I needed that animation of what was happening with randomization. With, you could see the cases, they moved, they didn't just appear in their new space. You could watch them. And you could probably see I had to build that animation myself because I couldn't find any existing tool that did that for the data that I wanted to use. So I think there's certainly space to have that kind of that functionality. It's not saturated yet.
All right. Thank you, everybody. It was wonderful to have you all together.
Great.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.